We enter a show in progress.
Namely that the genetic material is in the cells. It's a matter of chemicals and how they're arranged that makes for the different parts of what we are as creatures, whatever we are. And it's the taking of that genetic material and either fusing it into the egg, say, of another creature that has had its genetic material removed, so that you're taking whatever might combine and produce. You don't have that two sides to the story. You just have one side to the story. You take the genetic material, you get it into the egg of another that's just waiting there and gets no other input from its own genetic material, and that way you can make an identical copy. Or you just investigate and manipulate the genetic material itself and fuse it into, like you say, plants and animals to get like new traits, new mutations, new combinations that you don't know really what might come of it. It's kind of an experiment in and of itself.
That's right. A scientist can either add or knock out, delete, which they call knock out genetic qualities. And it might be useful to your listeners for us to talk a little bit about what some examples are, in addition to the cloning examples that we talked about earlier. And there's thousands of thousands of examples of this kind of research going on right now. Some of them involve taking, for instance, a freeze-resistant gene out of a fish, out of a flounder, for instance, and inserting it into a tomato in an effort to keep the tomato from freezing. Or taking a human protein that we talked about a little bit before and inserting it into the reproductive material of a goat so that the goat will produce that human protein in its milk. I think society in the United States hasn't really entered the public debate about this issue. It hasn't been talked about very much, and yet all of this technology, I think, brings about tremendous moral and ethical issues that the public needs to be more aware of.
Okay. I'd just like to emphasize one more time to people not too familiar with this area that when Ms. Birkholz talks about taking this genetic material, we're talking about being able to get at the very, very sub levels that are not visible to the human eye of chemical patterns that are responsible for the nature of life, sort of like what you thought was magic and mystery. Much of that has been, so to speak, found by science to be imprinted in a chemical code pattern, and that is what can be manipulated. But before, so we're talking about actually dealing with the substance, the organic substance of life at very, very minuscule levels that can only be seen with special equipment, and manipulating it and changing the very nature of life. And I think what you were referring to is the ethical questions of creating possibly monsters, of creating possibly problems that we wouldn't be aware of creating even clones, which are identical copies of genetic material that already exists as an organism or as an embryo and so on.
Genetic engineering is really different. It follows in the same tradition of, but is different from, the practice of selective breeding, which farmers and even dog and cat owners have used for centuries to breed desirable traits, or what they consider as desirable traits, so that a farmer might take a cow that produces a lot of milk and breed it with a cow that is known to have a long lifespan in an effort to increase the amount of milk production, directing what nature can already do. What's different about genetic engineering is that nature would not normally cross a tomato with a flounder, or a cow with a cotton plant, or human growth hormones with mice. And so it really takes the whole ability to tinker with life to a whole new level.
And it's also far different to have just an apparent trait at a sort of gross level of observation and try to cross it by natural reproduction than it is to manipulate the very inner asylum, if you will, of the cells of living bodies be they plant or animal, and literally tinker with things because those so much has been seen as to what genes are responsible for what features. Much more is not known, including even traits that we might find in a particular gene being sort of known to us, but what else might come along with that may not be known to us, or what secondary effect it could have on an organ part that we would never even imagine might not be known to us.
Well, that's one of the biggest problems with genetic engineering right now, is because it's a new science, and the effects of what researchers are doing have anticipated as well as a lot of unanticipated results. In fact, a lot of what's going on in mouse laboratories these days is scientists are literally experimenting. They're taking this gene out of the genetic material in a mouse's egg and seeing what happens to the baby mice, watching them to observe to see if they appear normal, if their digestive systems work, if they breathe normally, if they're able to reproduce, if their behavior seems normal, and many times the genetic tinkering will of course have an effect on the mouse's life, and all kinds of unexpected and painful results occur, which is causing a tremendous amount of suffering in the laboratory.
So you're talking hit or miss, and that's really how they find out which genes do what. And like we say, you can't really say in a lot of cases that you know everything that a gene does, even when you know a lot about it.
That's right. There's a lot of unexpected as well as anticipated results of the tinkering. And you can look on both sides of this and say that perhaps new discoveries will be made that will improve animal life as well as human life. So I don't know that we want to paint the whole thing with a bad brush and say this is terrible, except that I think there are some safeguards that need to be put into place to prevent some of the suffering that is now occurring.
Well, from the broad ethical, and I'm not here really so much to address the broad ethical personally. I know that that is something that you're more than welcome to talk about, and certainly ethicists are talking about that today. I'm more concerned about animal suffering. But on the broad ethical issue of whether we tinker with the chemicals of life, the substrate of life, I don't see the point to that. I don't see the point to doing anything with nature that isn't already there, except taking very good care of what we have. Preventative medicine, good clean air, lots of trees, not unnecessary waste or pollution, small farming instead of large farming, many common sense practical ways where human beings fit into the natural scheme of things, rather than try to, as has been said, play God and dominate the scheme of things and keep on trying to fulfill that age-old motivation to find out how you can make life, where does life come from? It's part of that very big drive that I firmly believe leads us into very bad, just shouldn't be there. And I think it's almost a rationalization to say, look what good things we can get from this, because we should be preserving and preventing and maintaining what we do have that is so beautiful and whole.
Unfortunately, it's a little bit like trying to stop Niagara Falls, however. Millions of mice already have been and continue to be genetically engineered, and genetic engineering research is being carried on with cows and sheep and pigs and dogs and mice and rats and fish, and it's happening. It actually dates back to a 1980 Supreme Court ruling which allowed genetically engineered organisms to be patented. And that decision, it was a 5-4 decision, actually based on or ruling over the patenting of a microorganism that was created to gobble up oil, like in oil spills, which sounds like a really positive thing. But the Supreme Court left to Congress the decision over whether mammals should be allowed to be patented. And Congress never entered that debate. The public never encouraged Congress to do that. And so a number of years later, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, based on that Supreme Court ruling, granted a patent to Harvard University in DuPont for the Harvard Onca mouse, which is a mouse that's prone to, by its genetic makeup, it has been genetically engineered to develop cancer. And the purpose of it was to study how cancer develops and to deal with and to research cures for it. But once the door was open to this mouse being patented, then the door was open to the door was thrown wide open for a great deal of corporate and academic investment in the whole issue of genetic engineering.
Oh, well, you brought up investment. Well, I would say that that's definitely an ulterior motive. We all know about so-called biotech companies and the drive to score big in the stock market world. But back to this oil-eating, was it bacteria, did you say? Or
yes.
Was it a bacteria? So they must have found some genetic material from bacteria that already was...
All of this, again, goes back to the development in the 1970s of recombinant DNA research, where scientists were able to fuse DNA, which is the reproductive material in living organisms, with bacteria and with viruses. They were starting to splice these substances together, and this sort of paved the way for all of the more recent genetic engineering research.
And some genetic material off of some of that had a propensity to gobble oil, or...
You know, unfortunately, that's the compelling piece of all of this, that scientists and others see potential for tremendous gain in doing all of this. But the flip side of it is that it makes living organisms, it makes tools of living organisms. It makes goats into human protein manufacturing machines, and it makes mice into test subjects for cancer cures, and in new and different ways.
Well, you know, I've never heard of really any use of bacteria that ingest or eat up oil being used in these many oil spills. Last statistic I heard was 10,000 every year in the United States alone. First, I've never heard of that lately. I could just not be hearing of it.
No, I wonder whether it never really worked very well.
And
because you don't hear of it, you're right.
And secondly, let's just get commonsensical about this grandiosity, really. They're just as that oil tanker. Is it off the state of Washington at Seattle? Where is it? It's somewhere in the U.S. right now. It's been on the news every day. 140,000 gallons of oil on a beautiful wildlife coast, spilled. Ultimately, first there was some spill, then they tugboated it out. They put some kind of barrier around it and tugboated. Then it broke loose, and the waves brought it back, and it's back in the harbor, and all that oil has seeped out, and so on. So, you know, I mean, I don't want to hear about bacteria that can do wonders. I don't want to hear about life on the moon, similarly, when we won't even have the means, because this place will be so destroyed, to go and set ourselves up there, because everything we need is right here on planet Earth, for example, as an analogy, you know?
Well, another environmental problem with all this, with genetic engineering research, is the development of plants, for instance, like Roundup-ready corn, or herbicide-resistant soybeans, which will resist the herbicides that can be sprayed on the weeds around them, so that theoretically the corn and the soybeans grow well, but the weeds die, which may increase astronomically the amounts of herbicides that are used that eventually end up polluting our air and our water.
Roundup should be banned. It's just that simple. I know that might sound, you probably can't take a position like that. That is so toxic and so incorrect to be in the environment in a spray form next to human skin in soil. It should not be manufactured. It should not be propagated. Last thing we'd want to do is make plants that can take more Roundup. And it also means that if they're able to sustain with more Roundup, there's also more Roundup that will be available to make its way into the human body and into the animal body.
Yeah, it's a danger. On a brighter side, though, there's also, I believe, research going on that would engineer corn to be resistant to a corn borer, and cotton to be resistant to the boll weevil, not to be resistant to herbicides, but they themselves to be resistant to the pests that might feed on them, which does have, I mean, you have to look at it and say, this has potential for helping to feed the world's hungry. And if they can, there's also research going on that would enable crops like cotton to grow where cotton has never grown before, like in brackish in soil that's near saltwater sources, so that countries that are currently struggling to keep their people fed and clothed may have access to new sources of food and fiber.
But you're changing the nature of life when you do this. You are changing the plant material. And what does this mean for the plant into future generations, and what is in that chemistry, and how does that chemistry affect the human body? These are all questions. Personally, I want no genetically engineered food. I want no bovine growth hormones in my milk. I want no genetically engineered tomatoes. I want, on the same subject while we're on it, no irradiated products. I want none of that. I want the whole earth, the pure earth, and as far as feeding people, it takes money. It takes money to eat. The world as it is right now has enough to sustain everybody. We have enough land and we have enough ways to grow food, but what we don't have is money.
We don't know what's going to happen to the environment, and that's the danger in it all. We just don't know what's going to happen when deer and mice and insects feed on genetically altered plants, and then the birds and carnivores that feed on those animals eat those animals that have consumed the genetically engineered plants. We don't know what's going to happen as these genetically engineered organisms move up the food chain. And that's a terrible risk that we're taking right now in terms of the work that's being done. We just don't know. There's an awful lot of unknowns about all.
I think I saw something about plants being made more fibrous too, and more woodsy-like, as like sort of wood pulp resources. The last thing that's what we have in this world. We have too much ammonia, too much arsenic, too much polyethylene, polyurethane, too much petroleum, and many other kind of drying, toxic, and kind of not rich and waterful. Water being, the element of life. We're composed of water, not salt water, but regular, pure, fresh water is really the substrate of life. We need more of that. We don't need sort of drying and chemicalized kinds of patterns in this environment more than we already have, because that's contrary to our true health and welfare and the true nature of what we are as
Yeah, although they're saying one of the things they hope to be able to do is engineer this disease resistance also into animals. Can cows, can dogs, can cats, can people become eventually resistant to diseases.
Well, it depends which kinds of theories you're involved with, also with medicine, and how you believe diseases are come about, and how diseases are prevented, and how life is lived. That's another thing too.
Another of the issues that's involved in all of this is the question of xenotransplantation, which is a huge word for talking about the use of animal organs as replacement organs in humans. And it's sort of, it's a complex issue because humans, I mean, everyone wants to live longer than we now do. If we're sick, we want cures. And yet, you wonder whether we as humans just need to come to grips with the fact that we are human and we're not going to live forever. And do we really want to grow animals? Do we really want to raise pigs with with organs that have been genetically engineered to be people friendly, to transplant into people to keep us alive longer? Or should we as human beings just say, this is part of being human and we're not going to live forever? It's a hard question to address, although another thing that's going on is with all of this genetic engineering research, there are some alternatives to animal use that may in fact help people who may be interested in prolonging life through organ replacement. There may be the potential for taking some liver cells, for instance, from someone whose liver is failing, and growing those cells in a laboratory, and growing a whole new liver to be able to transplant back into that person. In fact, recently, just right in this area, scientists at Children's Hospital successfully have grown bladders and implanted them into 6 beagles, and the beagles now are apparently living, the bladders are apparently working in these beagles, and the bladders were cultured from the beagle's own bladder tissue.
Well, I believe, if at all possible, to have a non-invaded existence, to not have to do anything surgical, or to live as naturally as possible. And also, what comes to my mind is the increasing prevalence, for example, of hepatitis C when you mention liver. I mean, everything you're saying about this nirvana that we're supposed to have, on the other hand, you can see so many escalating, and people might call it alarmist, so many escalating problems that are coming around in our biology, in medicine. What about the new incidence of flesh-eating bacteria that's made some news recently, and so on? What about kinds of flus and different quick diseases that take over the body, for which which just seem to happen so rapidly, and we know nothing about them, and these things there are even science fiction stories like this, except real situations like this happen. So
yeah, I don't know whether it is nirvana.
Yeah.
I can only report what you read in the media about the potential for all of this, and I could imagine some scientists saying, well, why don't we genetically engineer a cure for that flesh-eating bacteria, or genetically engineer bacteria that would destroy that harmful bacteria.
So which products could we say are genetically engineered now that we might be eating?
Soybeans are a major crop right now in the United States. Cereal grains are beginning to be engineered. And I mention the soybeans because most of us don't go to the grocery store and buy soybeans, but soybean oil is in a lot of products that we eat, and it raised a major uproar in Europe when the first shipments of potentially genetically engineered soybeans were shipped into Europe in the last few years. people sort of got up in arms and said, well, we at least want to know whether what we're dealing with here. Are these soybeans, is this soybean oil genetically engineered, or is it not? Shouldn't we be allowed to decide?
Well, the food supply, what kind of a supply that is, whether it's going to be processed or fresh, canned or whole, genetically engineered or irradiated and so on, is getting out of the hands of people more and more and more, which is immoral, is an ethical question unto itself, which we could hardly get into right here, and it's a very big problem. I definitely would be a proponent for small farmers and fresh food.
Monsanto is the company that produces the bovine growth hormone that we were talking about earlier, and according to their website, 25% of the milk that's consumed in the United States today, it comes from cows that have been given bovine growth hormone injections.
Well, when I went to my grocery store that I shop at frequently the other day, I asked, is my milk free of the bovine growth hormone? And they said yes, though my milk has no labeling on it of what's in it,
Right.
nor does it have a phone number that's a toll-free, has no phone number, and preferably a toll-free for me to cross-examine them. But what I really want to get to at this time, as I stated when I started, I feel very concerned for animals in the laboratory, and I'm much more fortunate sitting right here in every hour of my day than any of them are at any time, and I get to forget about all the suffering they endure. But I'd like to spend some time now talking about, from A to Z, what kind of suffering are we talking about to living creatures that can feel pain, that can feel distress, that can have to go through disease or go through surgeries, go through procedures, and what is their fate?
Well, we talked a little bit about the mice earlier. We could take an example of a mouse, for instance, that's going to be genetically engineered for cystic fibrosis research, for instance.
Which is a dreadful disease. Sorry to anyone who might have it. You can't breathe well.
That's right. The fluid builds up in the lungs. The body's unable to rid the lungs of fluid, and if not treated at all, I believe there's a shortened lifespan as a result. But what would happen to the mouse, for instance, would be that it would be taken from its little shoebox cage in the laboratory. It would undergo a surgery to remove...
Shoebox cage. The cage is the size of a
These
shoebox.
Are plastic cages that are set up in laboratories, usually in racks that are 10 cages high and 7 cages wide. And they're plastic cages that are designed for airflow and food and water and that sort of thing.
How many mice to a cage?
It depends on the kind of research being done.
There can be several in a cage.
There can be.
Which is not the way they would live in natural habitat.
Right.
Okay. And certainly not in condos piled on top of each other like that.
The mouse would have its egg removed.
Now, was that any kind of painful procedure? What does that involve? It's
a complex issue. The mouse would probably be given anesthesia. The surgery would not be done without anesthesia. But whether pain-killing medicine would be given to it after the surgery is a bigger question. The research is fairly new in understanding how much pain rodents feel and how to address that issue. In fact, that's a whole other issue that we could spend an hour talking about, is the amount of pain and suffering that goes on in the laboratory, and how, while there are veterinarians in charge of the care of all these animals, there's really been the amount of pain and suffering that occurs in laboratories is really poorly understood. And some scientists are actually working on this field in an attempt to develop new ways of evaluating how much a mouse is suffering, and identifying new kinds of painkillers.
Does that still include doing things that make it have pain in order to identify those, like stimulating the pulp nerves of the mouth or of the gums? Does it still involve things like that?
No. Many of the new approaches to pain evaluation involve observation.
Do they do anything to induce the pain on purpose? Or
No. You're talking about the hot plates and things like that are involved in pain research. Some of these new...
Does that still go on then?
Yes, I'm sure it does.
Okay.
But in terms of attempting to address the needs of animals for pain-relieving medication, there are researchers who are looking, for instance, at these cages of mice and saying rodents tend to be more active at night than they do in the daytime. So maybe what we need to do in order to really determine how much these animals are suffering by observing their behavior is to look at them under red lights at night to see whether they are moving about normally, to see whether they're grooming themselves, to see whether they're eating and drinking and otherwise behaving in normal ways. Which hasn't been done. Normally laboratory workers come in during a normal workday and observe the animals when they tend to be in a quieter stage.
Put yourself in the laboratory and be just this alone. Be that mouse trapped in one of those cage upon cage, and have things done to you during the day, and then have the lights go out and hear the hum of the machinery or whatever it is until tomorrow comes. Just imagine that experience every moment. But so then you don't know when the egg is removed if anesthesia is if painkiller is necessarily.
Anesthesia would be given. The surgery would not be done without anesthesia.
Which is relatively recent too, because there was a lot of things being done without the regulation of absolute necessity of anesthesia prior to the animal welfare movement.
Well, actually,
people could get away with it.
While we're on the subject,
yes.
It would probably be really important to mention right now that the U.S. Department of Agriculture does oversee the Animal Welfare Act, which was passed originally in 1966 and has been amended several times over the last 30-plus years. But it still does not cover rats, mice, or birds.
We have no idea what it would be like to be an animal getting your tissues extirpated and being in a cage and suffering a disease, and we have no idea. And we don't. What's out of sight is out of mind.
There is currently a petition before the USDA that would change the definition of animal and would in fact include rats, mice, and birds. And the reason this is so important is that mice are by and far the species that's undergoing most of the genetic engineering research. You hear a lot about sheep and cows and goats, but it's really the mouse that's the subject of most of the current research. Rats and mice, in fact, make up 80 to 90% of all animals in laboratories. So if you're saying that the USDA is inspecting species that people care a lot about, they care about primates and they care about cats and dogs and other animals being used in research, but it's only 10 to 15 to 20% of the animals in laboratories.
People care, but really it's still a minority that can carry this around consciously, even for cats, dogs, and monkeys and so on, because again, most people are favorable to animals. There are people who are not favorable to them and can't stand to be around them or might not even be nice to them. But most people have a soft spot for animals and certainly have a softer spot for cruelty to animals. And if you don't know, how are you going to know? Even though there are animal protests, just like you've told us there's genetic engineering. If you haven't been there, if you haven't been involved in it, how can it be on your mind enough? So it's really still a relative small, even tiny minority that is aware of this and, carrying it around in the consciousness. Now back to, and rats too, I'd like to say rodents, mice, snakes, spiders, fruit flies for that matter. Life is life. Life is sentient. That's why it can be used to begin with. And it's not called for to say, oh, that's only a rat, to be mean to a creature or to inflict pain because of its so-called status. Of course, rats are very smart creatures, which in my book doesn't even count on the totem pole of how to measure these things. Life feels pain. That's the thing.
Yeah, that's true. And studies have actually shown that even among people who support the use of animals in research, the number drops dramatically when people are told that not all animals suffer in laboratories, but people are increasingly opposed to the use of animals in laboratories when there is pain and suffering involved.
That's the thing.
And there is the issue that you brought up before, that animals in laboratories suffer to some degree whether or not they're undergoing some painful experiment because they are not in their natural environments. And so there is some at least distress, at least discomfort at simply by being confined.
Often even more than a procedure could be, just the incarceration. But who among us would volunteer or willfully go to a hospital and have them crack our head and sustain a trauma to us, but give us good anesthesia and take us through the recovery process, for example, or undergo an abdominal surgery to remove an egg and take us through with pain medication and anesthesia and so on? You don't do, so the idea that there's no suffering, of course there's suffering, even with painkillers, even with anesthesia.
Well, and some of the genetic engineering that's going on today, I mean, if a mouse is taken from its cage and its eggs are genetically engineered to either knock out one of its genes or add a new gene that might produce a disease, often this is happening with mice, that this work is being done and then the animals themselves are being kept on the shelf, so to speak, in laboratories while their availability is advertised to researchers. So what's happening in some cases is that animals are being genetically engineered to have cystic fibrosis or diabetes or Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease or cancer, and then they sit in the supply at the biological supply laboratory while the ads are running out to the universities and the corporations that might use them.
This is the buying and selling of life, is what it is. It's the trade in life. It's and it also crosses my mind. It's the trade in fetal tissues that goes on, which I wish people who are anti-abortion would take up some of these kinds of issues. And it goes back to the corporate drive to score big with stock profits, and we've seen a lot of fascinating cases in the stock market with these biotech companies. Many of which never really came through after so far with anything that was seriously useful to a great degree. But back to this suffering of the animal. If the egg is removed, that would involve a surgery. Mm-hmm. Okay, which would have anesthesia but may not have necessarily the painkillers follow-up, and presumably we don't know how much pain the animal is in, except that if you were to take a rat in the alleyways of Boston and do something to it that would cause pain in a human, you'd probably see pain reactions, withdrawal. The rat would want to withdraw from you, period. But if you had it up against the wall and you did certain things, you would see body reactions to pain, just like you would if it happened to a human. All right, so the egg being removed is a suffering right there. The being in the lab is a suffering. What else can happen to an animal regarding suffering?
Well, what else can happen is that once the scientists have done what they want to that egg, they will then most likely implant it in a second mouse rather than back into the first mouse from which it was removed, because it takes some time in the laboratory to do what they're going to do to the genetic material. And so what happens...
So, like, give me a thing. In other words, why do they don't have to preserve that?
Simply dispose.
Exactly. How do they dispose of the first mouse?
Well, I think most research institutions in this country follow the AVMA panel in terms of recommended euthanasia, which recommends chemical rather than physical means of euthanizing. There's also the public health policy, which similarly recommends carbon monoxide or other.
Which is gross. The
approaches.
Other day I was watching carbon monoxide come out of the car in front of me, and I recalled an incident in my youth when I was very young, in fact, where someone took some kittens in a paper bag and put them to I hate to say these things on TV, and I thought, what a way to die, to breathe carbon monoxide. This is some kind of suffering, you know, relatively quick, but still, if you really, really put yourself in the situation, it's a horror.
Well, and I think it's a tragic waste of life, and it occurs also in the raising of, or it's an issue also in the raising of sheep and goats and cows for proteins in their milk, because if you genetically engineer male cows or sheep or goats, they're useless, except as breeding stock. So what is society to do with those who are now transgenic animals? Will they be sent to slaughterhouses to become part of our food, or will they simply be euthanized because they're not able to produce the milk that the researchers were after?
When you have animals on a shelf, and I can recall people who experimented in my comings and goings, I know many people who've done things with animals, and they used to just order them, and not to be offensive to them, but it's this Bic runs out of ink, give me another one, send me a box of 10, and that's how it becomes. You can't help it. I mean, it's cheap, it's relatively cheap, it's your stock in trade, you have plenty of inventory. When you run out, you order more, suppliers keep plenty in stock. This alone is sort of anti-life. I mean, you're not there doing the kind of relating you would, even if it were relating to an animal you might meet in the alleyway. You're not relating that way. You're not having the same reactions.
Yeah,
it's usury.
It's treating life as commodities.
As
There's
objects.
No doubt about it. There is one promising alternative as far as the production of proteins in milk, and that is researchers at the University of California and elsewhere are genetically engineering grains that can produce the same kinds of proteins, which at least we don't yet know what kind of effect that those genetically engineered plants will have on the environment, but at least we know there wouldn't be the waste of life and the commodification of life that you have when this kind of work is done in animals.
We need a scorecard, though. We need a scorecard with where are we going with needing to manufacture proteins, how healthy are we with or without these things in the way we provide health care and the way we grow our children, the kind of foodstuffs we eat, the kind of lifestyles we live, the kind of chemicals we imbibe and breathe, etc. I won't get into that now. We've got to start having a report card before we talk about these proteins that are going to help us so much, okay? So the second mouse gets the implanted, genetically altered egg
with
that has been
genetically
fused.
altered genes in it. The new genetic material has been inserted into the nucleus of its reproductive cells.
The old stuff has been taken out.
The old stuff's been taken out.
Put that in there, you've got a new nuclear material in that.
Which can include sometimes some kind of a marker. Can include a marker gene saying that if the resulting baby mice have this human protein in its milk, have the gene for cystic fibrosis, have cancer-causing gene, whatever it is the scientists are trying to produce, that mouse will be black-haired instead of white. So there can be a marker so that scientists will know when the baby mice are born whether or not this mouse has been successfully genetically.
They can have it in the code that it will come out this way. Yeah. So all right, so this is really so So then the new mouse has to go through the surgery, this expendable thing on the shelf that you just grab and you get mad if it bites you. Don't kid me. Don't kid me about that. I've heard many a researcher talk about the friendly or unfriendly animal. You know how to handle animals. You can imagine. You can imagine what goes on. And so now this mouse has to go through a surgery. And the anesthesia and the painkiller or not, etc. And then what happened could be a carbon monoxide death when it's done with, or it could possibly even for some reason be used a second time or whatever. Who knows? You never know. Could be fed to a boa constrictor. That's a pitiful, cruel joke. What else can happen to an animal?
Well, obviously, if it gets the disease, if it is in fact engineered to get whatever disease, it will suffer and die of that disease. Another issue involved or related to that, if we get away from mice for a minute, is we talked a little bit about xenotransplants before. Pigs that may have organs that are genetically engineered not to be rejected by human bodies, because that's been a problem in the past where baboon hearts have been used in humans. The human immune system rejects the foreign substance and eventually causes death. And what they're trying to do now is engineer. There are 3 companies, 2 in the United States, that are actively working on growing pigs that are genetically engineered to have organs in them that will they'll trick the human immune system into thinking that those are human organs. And there are 2 big problems with that. One is, you were talking about the animals themselves. These pigs aren't out on farms. These pigs are in laboratories, in sterile conditions, so that they won't pick up any viruses that could then be transmitted to the humans. And even, which creates a very unnatural environment for an intelligent animal that likes to root through soil and be out in the sun just like everyone else. In addition, there's also the problem that's human welfare related, and that is that pigs can potentially carry viruses that we have yet to identify that could infect humans in the same way that the AIDS virus was transmitted from monkeys into humans. So there are, in fact, a number of scientists in the United States, among them a Dr. Bach at Harvard University here in Cambridge, who are calling for a moratorium on this research until we can absolutely guarantee that no new virus would enter the human chain as a result.
So we're talking about suffering from just being in the laboratory, the dimensions of which are difficult to fathom and are so numerous as well on a psychological and behavioral and usury kind of platform. We're talking about transplant surgeries that the animal has to endure, then being just rid of, so to speak. We're talking about being kept on the shelf with whatever condition your genetic material disposes you to, diseases, hairlessness, influenza conditions, etc., and often having to be isolated not only for purity, but for that you won't catch anything, but that you will not communicate something to other animals and to humans. So all in all, you're talking about, like, can you think of a worse place to land on this earth than to be a laboratory animal in general? Can you think of a worse fate?
Well, I think confinement would certainly be difficult, and the higher up you go in terms of the intelligence of the animal, I think the more difficult it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's yes, I do. But I even think like creatures like bugs and worms that are picked apart and experimented on. It's just not the way they would ever be living. And there's got to be some kind of suffering. To be alive whatsoever is to be sentient. living life is sentience, no matter what level of so-called intelligence that it's at. And we as humans congratulate ourselves with having the most intelligence. So could we pat each other on the back? Oh, you're so intelligent.
One of the issues involved in all of this, too, is there's been a lot of public opposition to cloning. And people are very afraid that some scientists might someday clone another human being. And I think people are sort of horrified at that whole prospect. And yet, if the potential for cloning tissues is allowed to go forward, there, as we were talking about before, there may be the possibility of cloning if people voluntarily say, well, my bladder isn't working, my liver's not working, my heart's not working, and I want a new organ. The potential for cloning a human organ, growing it in the laboratory and replacing your own, could alleviate.
Do you know anything about the scientist who was working with the monkey brain of putting it on transplanting it off a whole head off one body?
I haven't heard anything about that in years.
Did you ever?
I do remember hearing about it
I
a
saw
while
those
ago.
pictures recently. What that animal didn't go through. I mean, things that the monkeys go through and the mice go through in the labs. Oh, Lord of everything that you could have.
Well, one of the, I think, things that's had a positive effect on some of this research is in 1985, Congress passed amendments to the to legislation that required the institutional review committees at all institutions that are carrying on some kind of animal research. Each committee, and they had the committees before, composed of the scientists doing the research, the veterinarian in charge, and others. Now these committees need to also have what they call an unaffiliated member, which means someone from the community, not related to the institution, who is there really to represent the public consciousness on animal research issues and to raise questions about, do we really need to, what will be gained, what are the benefits to be gained by doing some of these horrific things, and do they really outweigh the pain and suffering that might be involved? And I think it's the more the community members of these review committees can raise these kinds of questions, I think the better off our research will be. These committees are also charged with making sure that each researcher has searched for alternatives to the research that they're doing, non-animal or in ways that would reduce the number of animals involved. And I think these are all very positive directions for research in this country. Hopefully we can avoid things like these monkey head experiments, the head trauma experiments that were conducted
they still go
Pennsylvania.
on. They still go on. It's military research.
The ability to build dummies that can replace the use of animals, all these kinds of alternatives will help move us forward towards a more compassionate approach to research.
To me, so many things, and this also is not never a cost-benefit. Suffering is suffering. If you wouldn't want to be there going through that, it's not permissible. And if it's for some esoteric good or some theoretical good, it's out of the question. Or for some other animals, it benefits other animals. You know, who are you to say to do this to something if you wouldn't want it to be done? So suffering is suffering. Pain is the bottom line. And I would say, too, that nothing will ever be free. Nothing will ever be well till all life is free, till all life does not have to endure this kind of subjugation, misery, and torture. Hell on earth. Hell on earth. I'm very pleased that you could come and tell us some of these things. I wish what you could tell us was in my opinion, more optimistic, because as you can see, of course, I'm not in sync with a lot of these kinds of technologies, and certainly not with biotechnology. But thank you very much, and I do believe we're in the dark about what a lot of, that there is research. I mean, we just know it vaguely, and we don't really know what it's like, what really goes on in research. We don't know what genetic engineering really is, so hopefully we shed some light on that. And there are just a lot of extremely important things coming more and more pressing into our needs to know, about which we could never really have experience unless we can delve into them somewhat like we did tonight. So thank you very much. And at the end of this show, I will have addresses for you of pertinent organizations that you would want to contact in reference to some of the things we talked about this evening. So thank you. We love our animals. We love our animals. And if we can love them and make teddy bears and stuffed animals, and our children can go to FAO Schwartz and just see all these animals and just have such wonder when they're children, such awe, and if animals can teach us as they can, the black panther that swims the Amazon, the lowly, so to speak, rat that can make its way in the city of Boston to such a graceful degree where we humans not so wasteful ourselves, leaving our garbage all around. So life is a gorgeous, beautiful thing, and I say let's preserve it preventatively, maintenance-wise, and gloriously, the best of what we have. We don't need to engineer it. We don't need to change it. We need to stop the things that are degrading our lives, our environment, and our animals. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Birkholz. Thank you, MSPCA. And on behalf of the MSPCA, please neuter your pets, those poor animals. I can hardly bear to go near the building or in there to think of the animals that will have to be put to sleep because they're surplus. So please neuter your animals. And thank you for having societies that care about animals. Good evening.